I had always dismissed the stories as local nonsense, the kind of tales people told in hushed tones over cups of coffee at the diner or under the streetlights that flickered down on the cracked sidewalks. They called him the Mirror Man, a figure trapped between this world and the next, who would appear if someone dared speak his name before a reflective surface at midnight. I had laughed the first time I heard it, like anyone would, chalking it up to superstition or the town's long history of strange gossip. But the older residents whispered differently. Their eyes, cloudy with years and secrets, would dart to the mirrors lining the old pharmacy and the antique store, as if seeing him there might still be possible. Some claimed he stole more than attention. He didn't just appear, he lingered. Watching. Waiting. They said he didn't kill, at least not in the way you'd imagine, but they never explained what he wanted, and that omission made the story more chilling than any horror I had ever read. I was new to this town, having moved into my grandmother's house after she passed, drawn to the quiet streets and the ivy climbing the old brick walls. Her mirrors were everywhere antique, heavy-framed, and slightly warped with age. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. But when I dusted the living room mirror, I thought I caught a flicker, a shadow that didn't belong to me, as if someone on the other side of the glass blinked while I didn't. I shrugged it off, but that uneasy feeling stayed with me. The night I heard the full story, I was at the corner cafe. An old man named Louis, known for his rambling tales and endless cigarettes, leaned in close and whispered, "You ever hear about the Mirror Man? Don't say his name. Ever. Not tonight. Not ever." I laughed nervously, though my fingers tightened around the coffee cup. I wanted to ask more, but Louis only shook his head and muttered something about lost souls trapped in reflections before shuffling out into the foggy street. I went home that night, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But as I passed the hallway mirror, I stopped. My reflection moved slightly behind me, though I hadn't moved. Just a subtle shift, a distortion like water rippling across glass. And for the first time, I wondered if the old stories were warnings, not jokes. Something was in there, something waiting. And despite everything, I felt a shiver of curiosity I couldn't ignore. That night, sleep refused me. I kept glancing at the mirrors, expecting, or maybe fearing, to see something move where it shouldn't. I told myself it was imagination, shadows playing tricks, the old house settling. But every time I passed a reflection, a subtle misalignment made me pause. Once, I swore I saw a hand linger at the edge of the glass, almost translucent, retreating when I blinked. My heart raced, but not with fear exactly, more with a strange, pressing curiosity. The next evening, I found myself standing in front of the largest mirror in the living room, the one that reached from floor to ceiling. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the heater. I whispered the name I had heard Louis warn me about, almost daring myself, half expecting nothing to happen. And then the air shifted. The reflection of the room seemed wrong, slightly off. Shadows stretched at odd angles and the light flickered unnaturally. And then I saw him. He was there, tall and thin, pale like moonlight, with eyes that seemed too deep for a human face. His form was fragile, almost wraith-like, but undeniably solid enough to make me step back. He didn't move toward me, and there was no menace in his stance. Instead, he raised a single hand, not in threat, but in some silent plea. And then he spoke softly, the voice echoing unnaturally, like it belonged both inside and outside the glass. "Help me," he said. I froze, unsure what to do. I wanted to laugh, to run, to scream, but the tone in his voice was desperate, honest, and it rooted me to the spot. He pointed to the small notepad I had on the table, as if urging me to write something. Hesitant, I picked it up, my fingers trembling. The reflection mimicked me, but ever so slightly behind, always a step out of sync, watching every motion carefully. I scribbled his name, careful not to forget the exact letters, and held it up to the mirror. His gaze followed, intense yet patient, like he was waiting for something I didn't understand. Then he nodded once and stepped back, the faintest ripple moving through his form. The edges of the mirror seemed to shiver, and for a moment, I thought I glimpsed a room beyond it that wasn't mine. Walls of shadow, windows that opened into nothing, and corridors that bent impossibly. And then he was gone, but the sense of his presence lingered. The air felt thicker, and the reflection of the room no longer matched reality perfectly. My own hands, holding the notepad, seemed slightly disconnected from the world I knew. I realized, with a shiver I didn't expect, that helping him would not be simple. Whatever he wanted, it was beyond me. And yet, the pull of that plea, soft, fragile, desperate, was impossible to ignore. I spent the rest of the night staring into every mirror, listening for whispers, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing at the edges of my vision. He was there, waiting, patient. And for the first time, I understood that curiosity had become a dangerous thing. But somehow, it also felt like the only way forward. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I needed answers, even if part of me knew I wasn't ready for them. I started with the old library, digging through dusty shelves and brittle newspapers, looking for any mention of the Mirror Man. There were scattered accounts, stories too vague to be believable. A figure appearing in reflections during storms, people hearing whispers in abandoned houses, the occasional warning scrawled in a margin of a forgotten diary. Nothing concrete, but enough to convince me he wasn't a figment of my imagination. Back at the house, the mirrors felt alive. I moved from one room to the next, carefully observing every reflection. Sometimes it was subtle, a faint shimmer, a shadow that lingered too long. Other times it was undeniable. Once, in the kitchen mirror, I caught a glimpse of a doorway that didn't exist in reality, just beyond the reflection. My pulse quickened, but I didn't feel fear. I felt compelled. There was a logic to it, even if I couldn't understand it yet. I started keeping a journal, noting every odd occurrence. Mirrors in the bathroom showed tiny shifts in perspective. The hallway mirror sometimes stretched the reflection of the floorboards like liquid. I even experimented, moving objects and watching how they appeared in the glass. Some items lagged behind, or seemed to occupy space differently, as if the reflection existed in a slightly warped version of our world. I realized he wasn't just trapped. He was part of a reality that ran parallel to ours, a world overlapping ours but obeying different rules. By evening, exhaustion had set in, but curiosity kept me at the largest mirror. I whispered his name again, heart hammering. This time, he appeared almost immediately. The room behind him in the reflection seemed darker, edges curling in ways they shouldn't. His eyes locked onto mine, pleading, and he gestured toward a small stack of objects on the counter, a notebook, a candle, and a lighter. "Do it," he said, voice soft but insistent. "Not yet, but start." I hesitated, fumbling with the items. The mirror shimmered around the edges, distorting the reflection of the room further. It was almost as if his world and mine were pressing against each other, straining for space. I followed his gestures, lighting the candle and placing it in front of the mirror, my hands trembling. For a moment, the flame reflected normally, then flickered oddly, stretching into something long and thin, reaching across the glass toward him. And then, like before, he vanished. But the sensation of his presence remained, stronger now, heavier. I could feel the pull of whatever he was trying to communicate through the mirrors, as though he was both here and somewhere else entirely. I didn't understand yet what he wanted or how I could help him, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I couldn't stop now. He had chosen me, and somehow that meant I was involved. That night, sleep didn't come. I lay in bed, staring at the reflection of the moon in the bedroom window, feeling the subtle shift of space around it, like the world had grown slightly off. And somewhere, deep in the layers of glass and shadow, I knew he was waiting, patiently, for me to take the next step. The next evening, I couldn't resist any longer. I gathered the notebook, candle, and lighter, placing them carefully in front of the largest mirror. The air in the room was thick, almost tactile, as if it had weight. I lit the candle, watching its reflection ripple unnaturally in the glass, stretching and bending toward him. My hands shook, but the pull of something beyond, something desperate and fragile, kept me rooted in place. I whispered his name softly, almost as if saying it too loudly would shatter the fragile boundary between our worlds. And then he appeared. The room behind him in the reflection was darker than before, almost black at the edges, and the floorboards seemed to stretch unnaturally, bending into spaces I knew weren't there. He raised his hand toward me, and I felt a wave of unspoken urgency. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't angry. He was pleading, almost painfully, and I realized that he had no other way to communicate except through these fragile distortions of reality. "Write it down," he murmured, the sound echoing as if carried from somewhere far away, yet close enough to touch. I picked up the notebook and hesitated. My own handwriting felt clumsy, the letters almost wrong as I copied his name. The candle flickered violently, though no draft stirred the air, and the reflection of the flame reached out like a thin finger toward him, trembling as it hovered over the glass. Once I finished, he nodded faintly, a gesture so slight it might have been imagined. Then he reached deeper into the reflection, and I felt it, a tug at the edges of perception, like the world itself was flexing around him. The mirror warped more violently now, shadows spilling from its edges, stretching across the walls behind me. I wanted to step back, to run, but my feet were frozen. The urgency in his eyes rooted me there. "You have to believe me," he said. "I'm not what they think. I can't, I need your help." The words weren't just sounds. They pressed against my mind, a strange, insistent weight. I could feel the presence of his world pushing closer. The glass no longer just a reflection, but a thin membrane, vibrating with something alive and unseen. I took a deep breath and followed his subtle gestures. I blew out the candle once, then relit it, careful to observe every flicker, every ripple in the glass. Each movement seemed to communicate something, tiny, precise, almost like a language I was only beginning to understand. Shadows danced along the edges of the room, twisting the reflection of furniture and walls, and for a brief moment, I glimpsed corridors and doors behind him that couldn't exist in the house I knew. Then he vanished. Not completely, but like a tide receding, leaving traces of himself lingering in the edges of every mirror in the room. The air felt heavier, the reflections no longer perfectly aligned with reality. Objects in the room seemed slightly off, their positions skewed, subtly impossible. And yet there was no fear, only the strange, insistent sense that I was part of something larger, something fragile and urgent. I sank into a chair, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The mirror was calm again, normal almost, but I knew it wasn't. Somewhere beyond the glass he waited, patient, vulnerable, waiting for me to take the next step, to understand the language of reflections, and to help him finally cross the thin, impossible line that separated our worlds. The following days blurred together. Every mirror in the house seemed to hum with a quiet tension, as if waiting for me to notice, to act again. I became obsessed with observing them, tracking the smallest distortions. A flicker of movement, a shadow that shouldn't exist, the way light bent differently in the reflection. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. And somewhere in those distortions, I could feel him, watching and waiting. I continued the steps he had guided me toward, lighting candles, copying his name, and arranging objects in precise patterns. Each time I did, the mirrors responded. Reflections twisted, hallways behind them extended into impossible darkness, and rooms appeared that weren't in the house. I began to understand that his world was overlapping with mine, fragile and mutable, and that the mirrors were the gateways, the only way he could communicate. One evening, as I worked on another set of instructions he seemed to suggest, I noticed something new. My reflection moved slightly behind me, not exactly mimicking me, but reacting to his presence. I turned my head slowly, and for a split second I saw a corridor behind him, illuminated by a dim, silvery light leading into shadows I couldn't comprehend. My pulse quickened, but fear didn't rise. Instead, there was an odd sense of urgency, a need to follow his guidance, to bridge that impossible space between worlds. He appeared suddenly in the largest mirror, tall and thin, eyes wide with relief when they found mine. He pointed at the candle, then at the notebook, then toward the edges of the glass, his gestures precise yet desperate. I realized he was asking me not only to perform the steps, but to understand the rhythm of the space around him. Each movement, each flicker, seemed like a language, a series of signs I could barely interpret but was learning to trust. I followed his instructions meticulously, careful not to rush, letting the mirrors dictate the pace. As I did, the house itself began to respond. Shadows stretched and recoiled unpredictably, corners of the rooms subtly warped. I could hear faint whispers, not words exactly, but vibrations, like the air was speaking to me through the glass. I felt a constant pull at the edges of perception, as though the boundaries between his world and mine were thinning, rippling with the pressure of something waiting to emerge. By midnight, the most intense changes occurred. The hallway mirror showed a complete corridor that didn't exist in reality, lined with doors that opened to darkness. I could feel his presence growing stronger, yet still fragile, like a candle flame in a drafty room. He appeared one final time, raising his hand toward me, eyes pleading. He didn't speak. Words were no longer needed. The mirrors themselves hummed, vibrating with energy I couldn't name, and I understood that each action I took was allowing him to inch closer to the fragile threshold that separated our worlds. And then, as if acknowledging my efforts, he vanished again, leaving the reflections subtly altered. The rooms seemed just a fraction wrong, floors slightly angled, shadows longer than they should be, corners stretching into impossible geometry. It was unnerving and yet compelling. I knew that the process wasn't complete, that his escape, or our connection, was far from over. Somewhere in the reflective surfaces, he waited, and the mirrors whispered with a quiet insistence, urging me to continue, to understand the strange, delicate rhythm of his world. The nights were growing longer, or perhaps it was just me, caught in the rhythm of the mirrors. I had stopped keeping track of time, consumed by the subtle distortions, the faint murmurs that seemed to rise from the glass itself. Each mirror now held a fraction of him, as though he had begun to seep into my world, but only partially, only enough to make me aware of the impossible. I had learned to read his gestures more clearly, to follow the quiet cues of reflection. The smallest flick of his hand or tilt of his head could mean something critical, something I might miss if I blinked. My hands shook as I arranged the objects, lit the candles, copied his name, every action precise, deliberate, and yet never enough. With each step, the house itself seemed less stable. Shadows moved independently, floors warped subtly, and corners of rooms bent in ways the eye could not reconcile. One night, I heard a new sound. Not a whisper, not quite a voice, but a vibration that hummed through the floor and walls. I realized it was him, or something he had sent through the mirrors. I approached the largest one, candle in hand, and the air around the glass thickened, like the room itself was drawing in a breath. The reflection shimmered, then sharpened, revealing him in full. His face was closer now, features more defined, but still impossibly elongated, limbs too long for a normal human form. His eyes were wide, desperate yet patient. He gestured frantically toward the candle, then toward the notebook, then at the edges of the mirror. I understood, finally, that the rhythm of light, gesture, and placement was a language. Every flicker, every subtle distortion had meaning. As I followed him meticulously, the mirrors around the house reacted violently. Reflections twisted, furniture warped, hallways extended into endless corridors, and doors appeared where walls should have been. I could almost step into them, almost touch his world, but the threshold remained out of reach. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed in this strange ballet. I began to feel it in my own body, a tugging, stretching sensation, as if the membranes of reality were pressing against my skin. My reflection lagged behind me now, mimicking me imperfectly, sometimes moving in ways I didn't. And yet there was no fear, only a fragile trust, the sense that he needed me to keep the rhythm, to maintain the delicate balance that allowed him to inch closer. Then, the most surreal moment occurred. The largest mirror trembled, the edges flickering like liquid. I saw not just him, but fragments of a room beyond the glass, strange corridors, walls made of shadows, light bending at impossible angles. He reached toward me through the reflection, his hand almost touching mine. I felt the pull in my chest, a pressure at the back of my mind, urging me to act, to complete what I had started. And for a brief moment, I realized that our worlds were overlapping so completely that I could almost step into his, almost become part of the strange geometry and light. And then he vanished. The mirror returned to normal, or almost normal. Subtle shifts remained. The floor angled slightly, shadows stretched unnaturally, and corners retained impossible lines. My pulse raced, but I was calm in a strange way, aware that the final step was coming, and that what lay ahead would demand everything I had learned and every ounce of courage I could muster. Somewhere in the reflections that surrounded me, he waited patiently, urging me forward, ready for the boundary between our worlds to finally give way. The final night arrived without warning, or perhaps I had been waiting for it all along and simply hadn't realized. The mirrors pulsed softly, edges shimmering as if aware that something critical was about to happen. I carried the candle, the notebook, and the lighter to the largest mirror, hands steady despite the thrumming tension in the air. Every shadow in the house seemed to stretch toward me, yet not threatening, curious, attentive, like witnesses to a delicate ritual. I whispered his name once, carefully, letting the words float across the room. The reflection warped almost immediately, bending the walls behind him, stretching the floor into corridors that could not exist in my reality. He appeared fully this time, taller, thinner, eyes wide with relief, and something I could not name. Hope, perhaps, or the weight of years trapped in reflection. His hand reached toward mine, not through the glass, but as if the glass had dissolved, just a thin, tremulous barrier between us. I followed his gestures with complete focus, aligning the candle's flame with the distorted reflection of the notebook. The light stretched toward him, elongating, quivering, bending into a thin ribbon that linked our worlds. The edges of the mirror rippled violently now, shadows spilling into my room from his world. I could hear faint echoes, whispers, laughter, sadness, folding over each other, layered like thin glass panes pressed together. Then he spoke, voice a quiet rush that reverberated in my chest, not my ears. Almost there. One step. Trust. The room's geometry shifted beneath my feet, walls stretched, corners curled impossibly. My reflection lagged, a subtle double of me, moving independently as though the mirrors themselves were alive. I lifted my hand, mirroring his, and the candlelight bridged the gap, a thin thread of energy that pulsed across the glass. Suddenly, he was through. Or rather, the boundary shivered and bent, and for a fleeting heartbeat, I saw him as he truly was. Not human, not fully spectral, but a being shaped of light, shadow, and impossible angles. His presence filled the room, stretching, folding, bending space, and yet it was gentle, deliberate. He looked at me, and there was gratitude there, almost unbearable in its intensity. Then, as quickly as it began, he withdrew into the mirrors, leaving a trace of himself in every reflective surface, a soft distortion that made every glance feel alive, watching, patient. I sank to the floor, exhausted, my hands trembling. The house was silent, but nothing felt entirely the same. Mirrors seemed slightly other, the air around them heavier, imbued with the faint pulse of his presence. I realized then that he had left a part of his world behind, and a part of me had crossed over with him. Not fear, not regret, just a strange, lingering awareness that reality itself was thinner now, permeable in subtle, unsettling ways. I would never see him again fully. But every time I pass a mirror, I know he is there, somewhere between reflection and reality, patient, waiting, a fragment of another world quietly pulsing just beyond reach. And sometimes, when the candlelight flickers at night, I think I feel a hand brushing against mine from the other side, reminding me that he is not gone. Not really.